Cool. Well, welcome everybody to the Never Ending Journal Club meeting number 1. Today we'll be discussing this paper titled Musical Pitch Has Multiple Psychological Geometries by Marjieh, Griffiths, and Jacobi, published 2023 on Archive. Yeah, so let's get right into it. So as you may or may not know, the most dominant model of pitch similarity is this helical model that takes into account similarity based on tone, so pitch height or tone height, so like how high or low the pitch is, as well as the tone chroma, which is, so chroma means color, so it's like tone color. So you tend to hear tones that are at the same octave as being more similar, even if they are at different tone heights. So this kind of model has been suggested and summarized by Roger Shepard in 1982 in this paper, but it's more of a hypothesis rather than, from my understanding, more of a hypothesis than an empirical study that shows you that this is how the data is represented. And it summarizes previous works starting in like the 1920s, all the way up to that point. And this is a dominant model, such a dominant model that now it's presented in standard perception psychology textbooks as well. However, the paper that we read today points out that previous studies on pitch, psychological geometry of pitch, has some problems or challenges from small sample size or ecological validity, such as using unnatural tone timbres of the stimuli, as well as other kinds of like priming or expectation effects. And there have been previous evidence on like the differences that can be seen based on how much musical experience you have, or as well as like cultural groups or developmental stages. And so this study uses 3 behavioral paradigms to study the psychological geometry of pitch using a large online study. And it uses it uses similarity judgment tasks as well as a production-based task for both musicians and non-musicians. So the 3, oh, I forgot to add animations, but I guess that's over preparation. But on the left side, you can see the 3 paradigms. So the first one is asking participants to judge on a Likert scale how similar are the 2 presented melodies. And then the tones are embedded in the melodies. And then there's another perceptual evaluation task with just single tones in isolation that you can see in C. Also on a Likert scale, rate how similar the tones are. And then interestingly, there's another production-based task that you can see in B, where they present, I think, 2 tones, which I guess consists of a melody, and participants are asked to sing back the melody as well as they can. And then they kind of derive the similarity between the 2 tones that are sung back from the distribution. I can try to explain how they do that if you are interested, or if you, yeah. And then they find that the perceived similarity of the pitches vary widely between different groups of people. So musicians who were professionally trained in music and were recruited from music schools, they tend to follow this very non-linear pattern in their similarity judgments, whereas non-musicians who were self-reported either like 0 years of experience or 3 years or more of experience followed a generally linear trend with some peaks in the octaves. And so they followed this up with a regression analysis to assess whether these differences are due to different kinds of perceptual cues. And these perceptual cues are geometric or structural properties of pitch, such as the linear pitch height scale, so like the tone height, the identification of octaves, identification of perfect intervals, and aversion to tritones. And we can see that these components differentially play a part or contribute to the similarity judgments, also based on the task and based on the group of participants. So to highlight a few points, we can see that for the melody paradigm, identification of the octave explained more of the variance in pitch similarity for musicians more than non-musicians. For production, similarly, the identification of octave dominates over the linear component of pitch height. And yeah, for the isolated similarity of tones on the far right, you can see that all three components, linear, tone height, octave, tritones, contribute for musicians, whereas it's only the linear pitch height that is contributing to the similarity for non-musicians. So this difference is quite large, which was interesting. And so based on these, if you do a multidimensional scaling and plot the geometry of the pitch similarities, you get these vastly different representations. So the helical structure that has been considered the most dominant structure is only reflected in the case of non-musicians singing or comparing melodies, and musicians comparing single tones, but you don't really see that kind of geometry in other contexts, which is very interesting. Yeah, so I found this paper to be very cool because it directly shows you these different geometries that can arise across groups and across tasks. And of course, although this paper wasn't explicitly framed within a qualia structure paradigm, I think for our interest, it's good to discuss how we can interpret these observations in the context of qualia structures. So are these MDS solutions represent qualia structures of pitch? Why or why not? And I'd be curious to hear what people think about the production-based similarity structures, since that's, I think, pretty new, and most qualia structure paradigms use a perceptual evaluation paradigm. And so, yeah, I wonder if you think that if this can complement those usual perception-based tasks, and if so, how would it complement them? And then the big question for me was so the authors say that these different geometries highlight the dynamic nature of pitch representations. It shows that different structural properties of pitch contribute to the representational geometry of pitch for different groups and tasks. But for us, does this mean that pitch qualia themselves are different across groups and tasks? Or do you think these differences show factors that are not qualia themselves, but just task related? And if they are different, how could these be distinguished either empirically or analytically, or maybe they're just too entangled? Yeah, so those were my starting discussion questions, and yeah, other thoughts or questions can also be discussed. That's it. 7 slides.
Thank you. Very, very, very good summary.
Okay, does anyone has a comment, question, something unclear about the paper? Yeah, Ken-chan?
Yes, so I have a question on the singing paradigm. So can you go back to the structural elements? Yeah, the linear the regression analysis slide. So here it shows that non-musicians singing response are driven by the octaves. I am wondering how that is reflected. So I can imagine one way that this octave component is influencing them is that the stimuli, the melody that present to them are intentionally constructed outside of their singing range, right? So for them to sing it as closely as to the original melody and with the octave underlying their singing response, does that mean they know to transpose it down by a few octaves when they sing it? Is this what it means, when octaves is, this high in their response? If that's the case, it is quite surprising compared to their responses in the other two paradigms, because the other two paradigms are the, perceptual judgment tasks. And in those tasks, they're like, they couldn't rate the octaves, the two notes as separated by an octave or two octaves as similar at all. But when they sing it, they kind of unconsciously, in a sense, use the octave kind of knowledge to reproduce the sounds. Or it could, this octave component could mean something completely different in their response, but I can't think of anything else. At least the knowledge of the octave is there, but it's only reflected when they are singing.
You mean for musicians?
Non-musicians.
I see, non-musicians.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question about, and this kind of relates to what Zoe mentioned, whether like this kind of active component of you're also creating something, it changes somehow what similarity, like in what way you are judging the similarity. And I mean, this data kind of agrees with that, because suddenly this octave component appears, or at least that's my interpretation as well. But I am not, I am one of the non-musicians, so I don't have a lot of musical training, nothing actually. So I like, actually this is kind of, for me, a bit difficult to imagine of like, okay, so okay, what does this mean? Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, I found a little bit difficult this paper, at least at the beginning, because I have zero music train, and I really struggled to relate to myself what they were talking about. So I can share that.
So
Well,
the four
actually, yeah,
components.
I have the same issue, and so I kind of discussed this with like a friend of mine who's like a vocal coach, and very much similar to what you said. Actually, he told me she told me something very interesting, which was apparently people have difficulty grasping it like theoretically, so that would be the two similarity tasks. But exactly like you mentioned, it's more natural to reproduce it, so that might be a thing. And she was telling me like, yeah, a lot of people actually struggle like very much for a long period of time to like get it musically. And another thing I was thinking about, I couldn't like ask her because it's mostly data, was yeah, I mean it's pretty close on the data sheet as we're seeing it. But in practice, I'm sure even that little misalignment would be, when you're singing, it's very important to get it right. But yeah, that could be it. She was telling me how it's very difficult for, like, I'm the same way. I'm musically, I'm like, I'm a non-musician. She was telling me like theoretically it's very difficult, but when they reproduce it, it's actually kind of closer. That could be one thing. Also, another thing, which could kind of be a question, so it's relevant, I could throw it in there. I couldn't spot what was the distinguishing factor for musicians versus non-musicians. So are these people who are studying music for, I believe one of the non-musicians
Professionally
was
trained.
1 and 3 years? Oh, trained.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
there
that's
were.
Well,
sorry.
Ken Chen was trying to speak before.
Okay.
Ken Chen?
Well, actually, I don't know how they group the musician and non-musicians, but In their similarity melody paradigm, they have three groups. One is non-musician with 0 years of musical training. The other group is non-musicians with 3 years of musical training. And then finally you have musicians who they straight up recruited in the music schools.
Yeah. So
And
there
then
are
they
two, So I'll just clarify this point from what I read. So there are two non-musician groups that were self-identified, and one group self-identified that they had 0 years of musical training, and then the non-musician 3-year plus is self-identified people who said I had like 3 or more years of musical training, and then the musician group are a group of people that were recruited from music schools who were being professionally trained in music.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Isn't it a bit misleading, non-musician with 3 or plus year of experience, although self-reported? As a label, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah, but I guess I'd have to go back and check like the exact wording of this, but I don't know if the 3 years were like training or just experience. So like I'd say I was never professionally trained in music, but I did play an instrument for more than 3 years, so maybe I would be one of these people. Yeah, but then musicians who are being professionally trained, they might have more like music theory knowledge or
Right.
yeah.
But then there's
Also, the
also
samplings are different, right? For the 3 different tasks, it's a different type of sampling because I noticed like some of the numbers didn't line up, or did I read that mistakenly?
Yeah, so for non-musicians, they were recruited online, just Amazon Mechanical Turk. And then yeah, I think the sample size was also a bit larger than the musicians.
I meant also like that each task I think has a different sampling numbers, or are they all the same? So singing back, similar tone, similar melody. I think they're different because I remember like the numbers were completely different. Or I could be mistaken, I'm not sure. So this one with the 0 non-musician has an N of 102. And then for like the next page, I think it's 91 people. So I was wondering, like, is that a drop in number of participants, or is it completely like a different sampling rate?
Oh, I don't really know
Okay.
about that. Yeah.
I guess it's
What's
just
your
potentially difficult to recruit more like highly trained musicians
That's
to
true,
the
yeah.
because there's less of them. Oh yeah, so but I was also just on this note, I think it's interesting with these kind of studies of experts versus non-experts is that and especially I think with music, like I wonder whether these people, like how far along were they in their musical training, and is it maybe they have a different perception to begin with, or maybe they are a bit more easy to learn certain things, or maybe they have like an initial talent in music, and that's why their perception is so different, or their stimulated rating is so different. Like, is this certainly a learned thing, or is it possible that maybe there is like an innate component? I think that's definitely an interesting question here.
I'm inclined to believe that it is to perceive music in this particular way is trained because it's under Western music theory, right? But if you think of
yeah.
natural musical talent, then surely if you train it in, let's say, a Chinese music kind of regime, maybe you perceive music in the Chinese music way or something like that, right? And relatedly, this group had another paper where they did a singing paradigm with Amazonian tribe people who had never been exposed to Western music. And the results show that their real response are not driven by these, Western musical structure. at least compared to the US, much less. So yeah, I think this kind of musical theory is definitely trained. And you can see that from how musicians, those who studied in music schools, are really, really driven by this. I think it's because when they get into music school or even in preparation for it, they really need to learn musical theories and learn all these different intervals and what their effects are in the music. So when they hear it, they're like, this is it. And then this is what it is, how similar it is supposed to be. And yeah, and then for me, I also I played piano for more than 10 years, but my musical theory is just terrible. I just had nothing. I can read the scores and play it. That's it. And when they say stuff like tritones, and I have to Google what it is. So
Yeah.
yeah, according to my piano teacher, though, she said when she listens to a chord, so like different notes play together, she can see that on the keyboard. So I think the same situation is happening here.
But there is some kind of natural tendency to feel like some chords don't sound pleasant
true.
or coherent versus some tones do. I don't know if that would depend on like your musical training or just
Yeah, that's also
Yeah.
very difficult to tell. So for example, consonance and dissonance, we, Western music will be like, oh, dissonance is weird. But I learned that in Georgia, not the US Georgia, but Georgia, the country, their music is largely composed of dissonance. So dissonance is good for them. So these are kind of a nature-nurture question.
Yeah. But I want to kind of circle back on like the observation that the octaves are playing a huge role for non-musicians in production. So I wonder what that would mean, like if that would shed some light on interpreting these results in terms of qualia, because like if it's really the case that octaves are playing a role in production because it's, say, like easier for non-musicians to like bring the notes down by an octave to reproduce it, like does that, like that would probably suggest that the difference here between which components are playing a part depending on the task doesn't reflect anything about the qualia of the pitch. Rather, it has something more to do with how they're performing the task.
Yeah, so I actually had a question about this because I didn't quite understand what the similarity or how they got the similarities for these. So if you know, can you like walk us through?
I have a very superficial understanding of this, so I will make an attempt, but if anyone has a better understanding, please jump in. But I think the similarity is being calculated between the two presented tones. So there are two tones, and both of these are target tones, and then what the participant responds with are the same, or reproduce same tones, and those are the responded tones, and then they get a like a distribution of the target response pitch pairs, and then they take the distance between those two distributions. And I think it's trying to account for like the variability in the response pitch, like given the target pitch or something like that. So it's more like a distance between distributions as opposed to like just the pitch of the two response pitches, if that makes sense.
So is the similarity between P1 and P2?
Yeah, yeah.
And to get that, they compare And when you say distribution
Mm.
of the response, what does that mean?
So this is where we run into my limitations. They
Right.
take the Gaussian kernel density estimate of the target response pitch pair. So like between the target
Oh.
pitch 1 and the responded pitch 1, you take the density estimate. So you get a distribution there. And then you do the same thing for target pitch 2 and response pitch 2, right? So you have pitch 1 and pitch 2 distributions, and then you take the Jensen-Shannon distance between these two pairs to get this.
And the distribution is across multiple trials of the same pitch.
Did they do multiple trials on
Don't
the
know. Probably, maybe.
same?
Like across people.
Across, okay, so across, all right.
I actually still don't understand how they do kernel density between the target and response.
Yeah, no idea.
So is a pure tone presented as a distribution or as like one number at one point?
I think one number.
So then target response pitch pairs would be two numbers.
Yeah.
And then they get the density estimate, which is to force a Gaussian distribution on the two numbers.
Don't quote me on this. I'm really guessing at this point. But I think it's like the response given the target.
Okay, so the
something like
distance
this.
between them.
Actually, they discuss it, I think, at page 8 in the last second last block. Right?
Yeah, but I
No.
think that's pretty much what Zoe kind of summarized, and I couldn't
Yeah.
like I think that's pretty much what we can get out of it.
Yeah,
but
I think.
if what Zoe said is true, which is like the distribution is across participants, then I think I can understand what they did. So like for one P1 P2 pair, you have multiple repetitions across participants, and for this P1 P2, you get a distribution of reproduced P1s and reproduced P2s, and you can probably compare or find the distance between those distributions. If it's something like that, then I can, yeah, that's what my guess is based on what I.
So basically the perceived distance between the melody P1, P2 is represented, I don't want to use the word, but represented by the distance between all these people's sung P1 distribution and all these people sung P2 distribution. I feel like it's they also account for the melody's tone itself somewhere, but I'm not sure. If it's just comparing the distance between the sung P1 and sung P2, then I can understand it.
Do you guys want to do the next paper on the original singing paper?
Just go back.
Yeah, you can do the summary, Angus.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're going back because it seems like we're not fully certain as to like exactly what was going on with the similarities for this singing task. But going back to the topic of like this octave and tritone stuff, I wonder if this sort of result is not actually to do with perception, but like some added layer, like some cognition or the way we just label things. Because I mean, just from a subjective experience. Like imagine or remember the time when you didn't know anything about music and you heard a song. And then 10 years later, after, you know, training yourself in music and studying, you hear the same song. Well, does the song then sound different?
Mm.
Or would you just describe it differently? Like now you can say, oh, the beginning is like has this interval and then it goes through this structure. You can say all this stuff, but
Yeah.
perceptually or, you know, experience-wise, I think it sounds exactly the same as when you first heard it before having all this musical training. So my interpretation of this is that these methods, where you do see this difference in this between musicians and non-musicians, I think it indicates that this sort of task is not getting at what people are experiencing.
The
Mm,
production specifically, or just overall?
Overall.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure this is the case because, for example, if you hear a certain account from a baseball player, they report that they can see the sewing on the baseball ball when it coming at them, right? And clearly, this is something that you develop. Or clearly, I mean, I don't know, but I assume this is something you develop with training and with practice, essentially, right? So in this sense, you could imagine this person that has seen countless baseball balls being thrown at him, and as time progressed, his perception of the very similar stimulus changed over time, right? So if this is the case, I mean, it could be honestly that's I think is one of the oldest problems is like when you see something black in the corner of your visual field and maybe you have cats in your house and you think that that's a cat and then you turn it's a backpack, right? That's a very common, I think. So the question is, what did you see? Did you see a cat, but it was such a flash experience that you misreported it, or did you see just a black blur that could be later interpreted as a cat, but also just as a black bird or a backpack? Or so this I think is it's kind of the crucial question on which most of the studies hinges on. So I honestly I don't see it as such distinct. I mean, what I'm trying to say, I think they're both viable answers to a certain extent.
I
yeah,
guess.
I think also. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Just to add to Francesca's point, I guess a more like analogous example with regards to like musicians versus non-musicians, which is expertise, would be like perception of say a chessboard. Um, you know, like the physical stimulus of the chessboard is the same,
Yeah.
but a novice looking at that chessboard doesn't
Yeah.
see like the patterns or like you know these additional information about the board, right? As opposed to an expert that looks at the same board. And so I guess in the qualia structure paradigm, do we consider that as different qualia? Like to what extent are we counting as qualia?
Yeah,
Mhm.
this actually it's been discussed in a recent paper by Aun and Tononi that me, Ken Chen, and other people discussed also in a journal club that you can find on YouTube. And the idea of Aun and Tononi is that, of course, they are all qualia in whatever way you want to think about it, insofar as it's something that you are experiencing, right? But then there is a sort of hierarchy of low-level features that are mostly stable across subject, and because probably subjects share very strong similarities at a neural level, and potentially within certain limit also at a cultural level. But then, of course, your own life trajectory leads you to have a different perception. Like that's literally what meaning is about, right? And you can have an even more simple example than the chessboard, when you just look at different alphabet. Like like I had recently the experience of learning the kanas in Japanese, right? So you start by seeing something that could be anything. Like you can snack in altered version. I wouldn't be able to tell which one is the real, which one is the altered one. But then at some point you just see the one specific symbol and you say, okay, that's ka, that's re, that's ta, that's da, whatever. So yeah, the question I think is how where we put the threshold for low level feature and higher order, so to say. But I highly recommend that paper. I think it's a very good paper. It makes very clear examples, and I think it's a crucial issue, obviously.
Yeah, I think also it's what Angus said has kind of two sides. Like there's this question whether experience or training changes how you experience a certain stimuli, and then whether these tasks are actually addressing that, or if they are addressing it for some people but not for other people. I think that can be also possible, that like these tasks may be facilitating or prompting people, maybe prompting experts to use a different way of assessing it that is more away from their actual experience, because they have this more structured understanding of the different tones. But then on the other hand, because non-experts have no tools or no kind of way of kind of organizing this, they might be more similar to their experience. It's complicated, I think, but I think it's a super interesting question, and I don't necessarily think that the same task, for example, will be able, if we can necessarily use it across all participants and across all experts or all cultures, because task will have some kind of effects and context effects, and also maybe just people with more training will have different expectations, or they will be kind of like assuming different expectations from the experimenter. So there's also this kind of effects that we need to account for.
Yeah, great points.
Yeah, that's actually very true, because this friend of mine that I was telling you about, she's been like coaching people in singing for a bunch of years, and going through what is called soulfish training. I had to look it up because like you guys, I'm not very familiar with it. And apparently they're taught to understand pitch. And she was telling me how frustrating this was, even though like she actually writes and like sings music. The understanding of the pitch not only does nothing for her, but it actually was kind of frustrating for her, but because she said, I'm getting nothing out of this. So in her case, it was like a reverse process of not only it didn't add anything to her experience, but it was actually making her super frustrated with just the idea of like music and music making generally. So yeah, I totally think that that's a factor as well, where you might even get the training and it you wouldn't get necessarily anything out of it, or maybe because you're not interested in it, it wouldn't factor in your responses, because at some stages it's also like a task. She might be so frustrated with it that like her performance in recognizing pitch wouldn't improve at all, and let only like even improve her experience with this thing as well. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can go back and respond to the chessboard sort of example, I think that's a good example to illustrate. Maybe I'm not sure if it's useful here, but like this broad and narrow qualia. Like if a professional chess player looks at a chessboard, they see a chessboard. Is it the case that the chessboard looks different, or they see the chessboard and they see something else as well? And then so the question is then, do you have a task which looks at only looking at similarity among chessboards, or a task which looks at similarity of this broad experience that you have when you are looking at a chessboard? So that's just something I just wanted to add on to that. But I also had another point, which is I wonder what the results here would look like if you are able to figure out or distinguish between participants who have I think it's called relative pitch, or who have bad relative pitch. So like basically the idea is to use task B to separate out the non-musicians or people with little experience to people into groups who can, reproduce fairly accurately versus reproduce pretty badly, and then see in this non-musician group whether you get this octave and tritone thing happening as well in the people who can reproduce. I'm not sure if you guys think that that's something that would kind of get closer towards or move away from like this theory cognitive sort of thing in the background.
If I bounce back the point, I cannot play music and I'm suck at chess, so this example don't work with me. But I have one ridiculous expertise, which is I read countless of books. I was member of association of lovers, so to say, of Japanese swords. Okay, so I can tell very quickly if I look at it. Like there are very cheap machine-made replicas, so to say, of Japanese sword that you can see almost everywhere. Well, not really, but like in many places. And it's something very quickly that I can tell, okay, that's not a real one, that's a fake. Then I'm not even particularly good at that, but in certain cases, there is no even debate for me. And it was very funny once my sister, when I was younger, maybe to make me happy, she, as a present, she gifted me one of those fake swords, right? And the second she presented it to me, I knew that it was a fake, and also it didn't feel like a great gift. So what I'm trying to say is like it's not that you reflect. I don't really think it's about. Of course, the expertise can lead you to make subsequent evaluation in details, and I assume it's the same for chess or for all these things. But I think it's much more similar to language indeed. Like if you can speak English and you hear me speaking English, even if my accent is not perfect, you will make sense of what I'm saying. And it's actually, I think it's impossible or extremely difficult to disentangle the meaning from the sound, right? You probably need to be in an altered state of consciousness indeed. So yeah.
I mean, actually, you can
Yes.
do this kind of experiments where you just repeat a word enough time, and then people are kind of having these weird dissociative experiences where it's like, oh, this is like my experience is no longer like the experience of the world is no longer like integrated, and it's just weird. So we can do that apparently.
Yeah, so those are good points. But I think there might be something different about melody, which is probably people can recognize different melodies, right? Like you give them two songs, they can tell they're different without, any sort of training. But you go to karaoke and then your friend can't sing it, right? Like they know the song. They know that, like, if you play the melody, they'll know what the song is. But you ask them to sing it, they can't sing it, versus someone who can. So that I think there's a difference there where like unlike language where you have to really know language, or like you get an intuition for this fake versus not fake samurai sword, with music, you can be familiar with a song but just not be able to reproduce it. Well, I think that's the case. I don't know if that. verified.
Isn't it the same with language? Like
Yeah.
there are some people that can
I guess
maybe
your own Chinese is like that exactly.
Oh yeah, maybe, yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, that's true. Though speaking and writing can be very difficult for some people because, like my BA is in English. We did some like actual language learning units. Yeah, so there are some people who can produce the language, and also usually that's the case where if they can produce the language, they can also absorb it. So if they can read and listen, chances are they can probably, sorry, if they can speak and write, chances are they can also listen and read, but not vice versa. So I actually do have friends who can perfectly absorb English, but they're not able to like reproduce English. So there's totally that distinction, yeah.
I think one variable here might be time, in the sense that this is just my intuition, and so I assume that a conscious experience is something that is rather quick, that comes and goes very quickly. So I think that when we focus on stimuli that spans across time, there is a much bigger chance that we are not talking strictly about what we call qualia. So essentially, if I see a chessboard and I see, okay, that you can finish the game in 3 moves, that probably has a lot to do with qualia. If I hear an entire song or just I don't know, 10 seconds of a song and then 10 seconds of a different song, I think there is more cognition involved in my process of, because I need to, for example, use memory in a different way, and I need to and I probably will use will choose some kind of criteria to compare the two songs, for example. And I'm not talking necessarily about this study. I'm just talking in general when we talk about stimuli that span across time, right? Actually, this is something I've been thinking for a while, but I never had the chance to discuss it with someone. So if any of you has some thought or
Yeah,
Well,
I think yeah, so I think this is kind of related to yeah, this thing that they are also like, so there's a quote in the paper where they say that the population and the task dependency effect, or like these variances, are they support the idea that pitch perception is processed in higher order brain areas. And I think this is kind of like this issue of when people are trying to address similarity or similarities in experiences, you are very quickly getting into memory effects, and then also the response effect of like you need to make a response to the task, and you will have a bunch of different cognitive like processes involved in that. So I think it's very difficult with a behavioral task to say that now we are actually comparing clear experiences, because you will, by just the nature of the task, kind of induce memory and behavioral like decision-making processes.
Yeah, I agree. And in addition to that, I think the stimuli of this task kind of strongly driven people to use the knowledge, like the music theory kind of knowledge to make their judgment, because it's always semitones apart, and then they sound like they come from a scale, so that people with more musical theory, they're more likely to judge things this way, but you don't even know whether it comes from their experience, like pure experience per se, or the musical theory because they recognize the interval. I would imagine if they use a more gradient stimuli, so between two semitones, you still have other sounds that's in between. If you include those in there as, you know, part of the stimuli, you can see whether you ended up getting these smooth helix or something else, right?
Also, quickly, I wanted to mention there's a book. I just looked it up. I couldn't remember the name because I read it a bunch of years ago. It's called The Power of Intuition by Gary Klein. I can read I can write it on the chat. This was a very interesting book for me because essentially what he does, and apparently he did this like in a like corporate scale. What he would do is whatever area people were in, he would essentially train their initial gut reaction, intuition to be more refined. So essentially, the process goes something like whatever career they're in that requires decision making, because he's ultimately like a decision making psychologist. You know, he studies that area. He would essentially train their mind in a wakeful, non-conscious way. He would present them with scenarios where they would have to make a quick decision. And what he says is, in the long term, if you train yourself to, you know, think about the situation, later down the line, when that situation actually comes up, you'll be able to make a very efficient and good gut reaction. So the way you guys were talking about it kind of reminded me of, you know, training, long-term training, having a direct effect on, you know, instant like cognitive experience. Yeah, I don't know how related that might be. Ironically, that is itself an intuitive thought, but yeah, I got flashbacks to that like theory where the long-term training had an effect on the like the moment-to-moment perception.
I think it's highly related because at least with the very limited amount of musical theory, you know, studying I had, it involves a lot of my teacher playing certain interval on the keyboard and be like, name this interval. And then you have to be like, what is this? And then you try to name it. Right. So maybe the similar thing has happened in here. And as soon as you play something like that, P1, P2, this is even easier because they're not played together. So P1, P2, and they're like, try down. And it's like, that sounds very dissonant and they're supposed to be very dissimilar. And the most terrifying part is that for these music school students, it's probably like an instinct. They don't even have this conscious thought.
Right.
It's possible like that. And it also reminds me of my experience in annual SEPs, the perceptual
Perceptual
I forgot the name.
diversity.
Yeah, the perceptual diversity online task. One of them is the pitch, they call pitch similarity rating or pitch discrimination. And when I say pitch discrimination, I was just sitting there waiting for semitones to be played, right? But I did half of the trial judging all the pairs to be basically identical, and I'm like, half of the task has passed and not the single pair is different. And then I was like, wait, maybe this is not about semitones, and then let me hear it more carefully. And then I realized they are really just like this different, not like semitones. So yeah, if they include something like that, I wonder what will happen to the music students and also to the non-musicians as well.
Yeah.
I guess we kind of see that difference also in this study because you see, I mean, there's kind of a difference between when a melody or two tones at once are perceived versus when they are evaluating single tones, sort of. So then does that mean, or yeah, does that imply that these like octaves or what's it, like identification of perfect fourths, perfect fifths, aversion to tritones, these are more higher level experiences as opposed to perceptual?
I personally would think the separation isn't that clear. For me, an octave is it's just so compellingly similar compared to like a seventh, right? So
Mhm.
I would disagree if you're saying this is a purely a cognitive phenomenon.
So you say similarity in your experience is a feeling? Because you said feels completely. I think you said feels completely already.
Yeah, at least octaves, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Well,
maybe if there's like super similar, maybe not that. It's kind of more difficult, but if the pitch is vastly different, then that would be easier to spot. So maybe it's kind of like the closer you are, it's the more subjective it is, but the more different the sound quality is, the more objective it will become. This is a very prominent problem specifically with like anything art related, because it's very difficult to like categorize. But yeah, I think you're right in the sense that if they're super close, if it's like all under one octave, then it would probably be similarity would be very difficult to distinguish. But if you go higher pitch from low, then it'll be easier to spot.
Yeah. That reminds me, all the stimuli in this paper are, within 2 octaves, if I remember correctly. At least the
Three or
task
two?
A and task C. And then I was thinking about it when I was reading it. Perhaps the reason why pitch height hasn't played a strong role in the musician's judgment is because 2 octaves isn't a big deal for them, when it comes to pitch height, right?
right, the range is much wider.
Yeah.
Cool. So we have passed the 1 hour mark, and it seems like discussion is dying down. I think, yeah, I guess maybe we could finish with like a round of final thoughts or something.
Sure. I just want to say, like, there also I did like I think I'm not sure I'm not sure exactly who mentioned it, but yeah, I also looked up like studies for pitch versus like a genetic factor, and yeah, I could find like 5 articles, but I couldn't go through them. But apparently, yeah, genetic is very much a thing. There was even one twin studies that sort of confirmed that yeah, there is a genetic component to it. Some people are just naturally, more pitch ready, if that's the term, yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess I definitely don't have absolute pitch. Maybe
Yeah,
relative pitch. I think that is definitely a big individual difference.
yeah.
Yeah, I think if anything, this study kind of shows maybe like a potential way of possibly studying like the contribution of different components in a similarity structure, and definitely like the importance of um, context and task demands in the resulting similarity data. Um, yeah, and I just really liked that it shows different MDS solutions for pitch, like the same physical stimuli, although the task was different and like the derivation of the similarities were different. I think that's kind of, I haven't seen a lot of that, so it was very interesting and refreshing to see, and I think it raises a lot of relevant questions of our interest.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to see more studies like this where not just one type of task or similarity is included, but there is like these tiny tweaks or like, yeah, a more like, yeah, kind of different angles on similarity. This is a very cool example of that.
Other final remarks?
Yeah, I this is actually maybe more a question, but I found interesting that you said that the studies by Shepard or the spiral that is taken as the sorry, you said that is not taken as the current empirically validated model, but more of a generally agreed upon working hypothesis, if I understood your presentation correctly. And I found it interesting because here they give it for granted in the very first few lines. And at the same time, they give for granted a whole certain basically, sorry, I cannot find the exact quote, but basically it feels like they are assuming something, even though this is then what they're going to challenge. But I found it interesting because I guess that then there is a whole missing explanatory framework where you need to contextualize these geometrical shapes or representation, because they also basically they assume that this is the current consensus, and that this is what explain or aim to explain representation of internal representation that support perception, action, and decision making, which for sure it's probably the way in which most cognitive neuroscientists talk nowadays, but these are very ill-defined and theoretically problematic terms. So yeah, this is more, I think, a general remark on this literature that I personally will always find incomplete if you then cannot contextualize this kind of jargon.
By jargon, you're referring to decision
Well,
making. Oh.
no. I mean that I guess we can more or less agree upon. But the whole idea of representation and also what does it mean that like what is the relation between the geometrical shape, the representation, and the actual qualia, whether or not you think that the qualia is the ultimate explanatory target of this model or not. But I think they do, even though they don't necessarily assume so.
Right. Just a perhaps minor note to the author's defense. I think they say towards the end of page 1, like the double helix representation had been suggested as a possibility by Shepard, but has never previously been observed in psychological data. So I don't think they're
Really, they say so?
yeah, I don't think they're taking I think they are kind of coming from like a position of maybe skepticism about this double helical representation of pitch geometry, and their conclusion is that yes, it's not enough to account for it. And here are all the different geometries that we find across tasks and across groups. And actually, this is kind of what prompted me to at least skim over the original Shepard paper from '82, because I had actually thought that it was a empirical paper without reading it, but it's not an empirical paper. There were empirical studies before that studying pitch in like music theory and also in psychology, but that Shepard paper that is so seminal is really just proposing like, given these previous evidences, this helical structure is might be like the best one to represent. And that is really what's being taught in psychology classes as the dominant model, but it's really kind of glossing over these nuances, I guess, is what they're trying to say.
Yeah, thank you very much for the clarification. You're absolutely right. I went to reread both the sentence you mentioned and the introduction. That what misled me, I think, is that they say the geometric structure of those representations determines how stimuli are internally organized and facilitates computation and generalization. And the reference for that is our studies by Shepard. So I made the association, but these are two separate statements, right? And I would still challenge this one statement potentially, but these are two separate things. So thank you very much for the clarification.
I definitely agree on your second point. Like, it's not clear exactly like what this structure is supposed to be of.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just had one other thing, which is back to this cognitive sort of potential cognitive level, how to deal with that. And maybe, I don't know if it's been done, but like some sort of dual task experiment. I don't know how you can do it with sound, but like basically have some sort of distractor task where they have to discriminate something. And then in the background, they do this similarity task. And then, well, if they do it, then do we see this octave thing disappear in the musicians, or does it stay there, or something like that? Just to further get close, like try and get rid of this cognitive thing.
The problem is that then you're probably assessing a different kind of experience, right? That's
Say
so.
if the say if the task is, if the distractor task is visual or something, like a different modality, but it's very difficult, so they really have to pay attention to it. And then maybe make the tones more difficult to hear, like add some sort of noise, but like still you can, if you were to pay attention, you could hear it very clearly. Something like that, which just makes it harder for them to like repeat the notes in their head or like think about it or something like that.
Oh, interesting.
Ken Chen, some final conclusion, remarks, open questions? Nothing?
I don't have much to add at this point because I have basically, talked about all the things I'm really interested about this paper. Yeah, I think I agree with Zoe and Aniko that we should do more experiments or more projects that integrate multiple different similarity tasks. Because that's, I think, what we lack within the qualia structure currently.